Here's a story inspired by the real events surrounding the release of 14 Canadian wolves into the wild by the United States, specifically during the Yellowstone National Park reintroduction effort in 1995. This narrative weaves together historical context with a touch of imagination to bring the wolves' journey to life. The Journey of the 14. In the crisp, snow-laden air of Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada, the year was 1995. The forest was alive with the quiet rustle of pine needles and the distant calls of elk. But beneath the towering Rockies, a different kind of movement was stirring. 14 gray wolves, sleek, powerful creatures with coats of silver, black, and gray, lived their lives unaware that they were about to become pioneers in a story that would echo across borders and generations. These wolves were not ordinary. They were chosen, not by fate alone, but by human hands guided by a vision to heal a wounded ecosystem. For decades, wolves had been absent from Yellowstone National Park in the United States, hunted and driven out until their howls no longer haunted the valleys. By the 1930s, the park's landscape had shifted. Elk populations boomed, overgrazing stripped the willows and aspens, and the balance of nature tilted askew. But in 1974, the gray wolf gained protection under the Endangered Species Act, and whispers of their return began to grow into a plan. On a cold January morning, the wolves' world changed. Biologists, veterinarians, and wildlife experts descended upon Jasper, armed with tranquilizer darts and a mission. The pack, 7 males and 7 females, including alphas with piercing eyes and pups still finding their strength, was carefully tracked and sedated. Each wolf was examined, their thick fur brushed by gloved hands as blood samples were taken, ear tags attached, and microchips implanted. They were lifted gently onto stretchers, their breathing slow and steady, and loaded into crates aboard a rumbling aircraft. The hum of the engines drowned out the forest's silence as the plane lifted off, carrying the 14 across the invisible line between Canada and the United States. The destination was Yellowstone, a sprawling wilderness of geysers, rivers, and mountains that hadn't known wolves in over half a century. On January 12, 1995, the crates touched down near the Lamar Valley, a place that would soon become their new home. The wolves, still groggy from sedation, were moved to acclimation pens, fenced enclosures designed to give them time to adjust. For weeks, they paced the snowy ground, sniffing the unfamiliar air rich with the scent of elk, bison, and pine. The alpha male of the Crystal Creek pack, a broad-shouldered beast with a silver mane, stood tallest among them, his amber eyes scanning the horizon as if sensing the freedom that awaited. The humans watching from afar held their breath. Ranchers in nearby Montana and Idaho grumbled, fearing for their livestock, while conservationists cheered, dreaming of a restored balance. The wolves, though, cared little for the debates of men. They were a family, bound by instinct and the rhythm of the wild. After 2 months, the gates of the pens swung open. The alpha male stepped out first, his paws sinking into the snow as he tested the ground. One by one, the others followed, 14 shadows slipping into the vastness of Yellowstone. Their howls rose that night, a chorus that hadn't been heard in those mountains for decades, sending shivers through the elk herds and a ripple of life through the ecosystem. The wolves adapted quickly. They hunted elk with precision, their teamwork thinning the herds and allowing the overgrazed valleys to breathe again. Willows sprouted along the riverbanks, beavers returned to build their dams, and songbirds found new homes in the regenerating forests. Coyotes, once unchecked, retreated before the wolves' presence. Yet the 14 faced challenges: harsh winters, human fears, and the occasional stray bullet from those who saw them as threats rather than saviors. Among them was a young female, her coat a soft gray flecked with white, who roamed with a quiet fierceness. She bore the first litter of pups in Yellowstone that spring, hiding them in a den beneath a rocky outcrop. Her mate, a black-furred male from the original 14, stood guard as the tiny wolves yipped and tumbled, their eyes bright with the promise of a new generation. Years passed, and the 14 became legends. Their descendants spread beyond Yellowstone into Idaho and Montana, weaving their bloodline into the fabric of the northern Rockies. By 2005, the wolf population had grown to nearly 1,700. A testament to the success of that bold journey from Jasper. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called it an amazing success, though the ranchers' protests never fully faded. The story of the 14 Canadian wolves is one of resilience, of creatures uprooted from their home, thrust into a strange land, and thriving against the odds. They didn't just survive, they reshaped a world that had forgotten them, proving that sometimes the wild can find its way back, one howl at a time. This tale is grounded in the real reintroduction of 14 wolves from Jasper National Park to Yellowstone in 1995, part of a broader effort to restore the gray wolf to the northern Rockies. The details of their capture, transport, and release are historically accurate, while the personal traits and experiences of the wolves are imagined to bring their journey to life. Ecosystem impact details. The release of the 14 Canadian gray wolves into Yellowstone National Park in 1995 triggered a cascade of ecological changes, often referred to as a trophic cascade. This reintroduction didn't just bring wolves back to the landscape, it reshaped the entire ecosystem in profound and measurable ways. Below are the detailed impacts on Yellowstone's ecosystem, based on decades of scientific observation and study. 1. Regulation of prey populations. Elk. Before reintroduction. By the mid-20th century, wolves had been eradicated from Yellowstone, leaving elk without their primary natural predator. Elk numbers swelled, peaking at around 19,000 in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This overpopulation led to intense overgrazing, particularly in winter ranges like the Lamar Valley. After reintroduction, the 14 wolves and their growing population, which reached 94 in Yellowstone by 2005, began preying on elk. By 2003, elk numbers in the northern range dropped to around 9,000, roughly half their pre-wolf peak. Wolves targeted weaker individuals, calves, elderly, or sick elk, improving the overall health of the herd while reducing its size. Behavioral shift. Beyond direct predation, wolves instilled a landscape of fear. Elk avoided open valleys and riverbanks where they were more vulnerable, shifting their grazing patterns to forested or higher elevation areas. This reduced pressure on lowland vegetation. 2. Vegetation recovery willows and riparian zones. With elk grazing curtailed, willow trees and other riparian vegetation along rivers like the Lamar and Yellowstone began to recover. Pre-reintroduction, willows were stunted, rarely growing taller than a few feet due to constant browsing. Post-wolf studies, by Ripple and Beshta in 2004, showed willow stands regenerating, some reaching heights of 6 feet by the early 2000s. Aspens and cottonwoods. Upland aspens and cottonwoods also saw a resurgence. Tree ring data indicated that new growth spiked after 1995, as elk avoided areas where wolves were active. By 2010, some aspen stands had doubled in density. Mechanism. The wolves didn't eliminate elk entirely, but changed their behavior enough to give plants a chance to rebound. This recovery stabilized riverbanks, reduced erosion, and cooled streams by providing shade. 3. Benefits to other species. Beavers. The regrowth of willows benefited beavers, who rely on these trees for food and dam building. Pre-wolf, beaver dams were scarce in Yellowstone's northern range. By the early 2000s, beaver activity increased, creating ponds that altered hydrology, slowing water flow, raising water tables, and expanding wetlands. Songbirds and small mammals. Taller willows provided nesting sites for songbirds like the willow flycatcher and yellow warbler, whose populations had declined with habitat loss. Small mammals, such as voles and mice, thrived in the denser undergrowth, supporting a broader food web. Scavengers. Wolf kills left carrion for scavengers like ravens, eagles, bears, and coyotes. Studies estimated that wolves provided up to 24 pounds of carrion per square mile annually in winter, boosting scavenger populations. Bald eagle sightings, for instance, increased near wolf kill sites. 4. Impact on competitors. Coyotes had flourished in the absence of wolves, preying heavily on small mammals and pronghorn fawns. After 1995, wolves, larger and more dominant, killed or displaced coyotes, reducing their numbers by 50% in some areas within a few years. This relieved pressure on pronghorn populations, whose fawn survival rates improved. Grizzly bears benefited indirectly. They often stole wolf kills, especially in spring when emerging from hibernation. This additional food source may have bolstered bear cub survival, though direct data is less conclusive. 5. Hydrological and landscape changes. River dynamics. Vegetation recovery stabilized riverbanks, reducing erosion and narrowing channels that had widened due to overgrazing. Research by Beshta and Ripple in 2012 showed that rivers like Soda Butte Creek became less braided and more defined post-wolf, improving aquatic habitats. Biodiversity boost. The chain reaction, fewer elk, more plants, better wetlands, created niches for amphibians, fish, and insects. For example, trout benefited from cooler, shaded streams, and wetland species like frogs saw habitat expansion. 6. Long-term ecosystem balance population. Stabilization. By 2021, Yellowstone's wolf population stabilized at around 100 to 120, with elk at 5,000 to 7,000 in the northern range, a sustainable balance. The wolves self-regulated through territorial conflicts and prey availability, preventing overpredation. Cascade effects. The changes rippled beyond Yellowstone. Wolves dispersing into Idaho and Montana influenced ecosystems there, with similar vegetation recovery noted in areas like the Gallatin Range. Controversies and caveats. Human conflict. Ranchers outside the park reported livestock losses, about 50 to 100 cattle and 200 to 300 sheep annually by the early 2000s, leading to legal wolf killings, around 10 to 15% of the population yearly. This sparked debate over whether the ecological benefits justified economic costs. Other factors. Some scientists argue that climate shifts, wetter years in the 1990s, and human hunting of elk also aided vegetation recovery, not wolves alone. However, studies like Marshall and al. In 2013 affirm that wolf presence amplified these effects significantly. Conclusion. The release of those 14 Canadian wolves didn't just reintroduce a species, it rewired Yellowstone's ecological engine. From elk to willows, beavers to bears, the wolves' return demonstrated nature's interconnectedness, proving that a single species can be a keystone, holding an entire ecosystem together. By March 2025, their legacy endures, with over 500 wolves across the northern Rockies and a greener, wilder Yellowstone as their testament.